That was a little improvised piece of mine, and I hope you enjoyed it. The most notable thing about that piece of music, other than it being primarily in the key of E major, was the fact that it primarily utilizes triads throughout the entire piece of music. And not only basic triads that sound a little bit like this, but also some of the most important triads on guitar, and those are spread triads, which sound a little bit like this. It's a beautiful sound, and I talk about it a lot in my masterclass, How to Solo with Triads, at bensguitarclub.com. But by the time I'm talking to you right now, I've taken a moment and transcribed the little improvisation that you heard at the start of the video, and I'd like to go through this improvised piece of music with you just to show you the power of spread triads. One of the beautiful aspects of spread triads is that we can cycle through fourth intervals and make it sound like a different chord progression entirely. For example, we start off with 3 triads cycling through fourths, but it doesn't really sound that way. Let's take a closer look. We have an E triad, followed by an A triad, followed by a D sharp diminished triad. A really interesting sound utilizing inversions of spread triads, which are also explained in great depth in How to Solo with Triads. In root position, these triads would sound something like this, which does sound quite nice in my opinion. But when we effectively utilize inversions, we get something a little more elusive, but a little more logical as well. Now, to follow down the path of logic, we're going to resolve the D sharp diminished triad here to an E major triad by utilizing effective voice leading, a little bit like this. D sharp diminished triad to E major triad. Next up, we have an A major triad. Then let's move 2 notes in this A major triad up a whole step. Believe it or not, this movement of 2 notes up a whole step gives us an entirely different triad, from an A major triad to an inversion of a D sharp diminished triad. And the beauty of that D sharp diminished triad is that the lowest note in the triadic voicing is an A natural. So it sounds as though A is the bass note. Beautiful sound. Once again, by utilizing effective voice leading, we're going to resolve this D sharp diminished triad to an E major triad, much like this. We'll follow that up by utilizing some more effective voice leading and making an interesting harmonic choice by next playing an F sharp diminished triad. This particular inversion of an F sharp diminished triad features a C natural as the lowest note in the voicing. So in effect, we can utilize an F sharp diminished triad which sounds like it has a C in the bass. Very effective and beautiful sound while remaining entirely triadic. The melodic sequence at this point sounds a bit like this. The final chord we landed on there was a G sharp diminished triad, which once again utilizes the same principle of this time having a D as the lowest note, which distracts from this being a basic diminished triad sound and makes it sound like something different entirely. Very effective indeed. And we resolve this by playing the following triad. Resolving it down to A major triad in inversion, and then finally an A minor triad in inversion down to an E major triad. That more or less establishes the entirely triadic main theme of our piece of music. Let's hear it in action. Of course, since we've now stated this main theme, I thought it would be perfect to throw in an improvised triadic phrase, which sounded a little bit like this. Once again, just utilizing the power of triads, in this case, primary triads, an E major triad, an A major triad, and a B major triad. E major, A major, and B major are triads 1, 4, and 5 in the key of E major, and this makes them our primary triads. It's always a very powerful sound that you can go back to when soloing in a major key. After this improvised phrase, of course, I return to the main theme of the piece of music, which sounds a bit like this, and it's much like the first time I stated it. And at that point, I stop, and rather than resolving to our G-sharp diminished chord as I did the first time, we're going to treat this more as a type of cadence point, where we're going to resolve to C-sharp minor, and it's going to sound a bit like this. From our cadence point here, which is mimicking the sound of A flat 7, or G-sharp 7 I should say really, to C-sharp minor. So the second time we state our entirely triadically based main theme here, it sounds a little bit like this. Cadence point and resolve to C-sharp minor, which actually turns out to be a rather nice resolution. I'm glad I thought of it. Now we have another resolution which plays upon the idea of common tones, and it also causes us to have a modulation. So our common tone here is E natural. So we're going to play C-sharp minor, which has an E natural as the highest note in the voicing, and we're going to hold on to that E and change the voicing to an E diminished triad, which sounds a bit like this. Once again, this is in such an inversion where the lowest note is in fact a B flat, which makes it sound like the root note is in fact B flat when the root note is actually E. This creates a type of mock cadence that lands us in the key of F major and sounds a bit like this. Then we repeat our mock cadence down a whole step and it lands us in E flat major. Now we've got to work out how to get back home to E major. Well, this particular voicing of E flat major is pretty close to B major. B major is of course the 5 chord of E major, but just to make it a little more interesting before we resolve back to our home chord of E, we're going to throw in a few other chords. So we go from B major to C sharp minor in a few inversions. Then finally F sharp minor, the 2 chord of E major, B major, the 5 chord of E major, and then finally we'll resolve to an E major, add 2 chord. To finish this piece of music off, we will of course have none other than an entirely improvised phrase, which, if I recall correctly, was not strictly triadic, but hey, let's live a bit dangerously. It sounded something like this. And finally resolving to E major. So it just goes to show you how useful spread triads can be, not only improvisationally, but compositionally as well, and they sound so beautiful on guitar. Let me know what you think. Have you used spread triads in your improvisation or your compositions? Drop a comment and let me know. And if you'd like to learn more about triads, check out How to Solo with Triads at bensguitarclub.com. I'll see you next time.